She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She didn't throw anything across the room or call her mother or post anything on social media. She sat at a $14,000 mahogany dining table that she had picked out herself in a house she had helped build from nothing, across from a man she had loved for 22 years, and she folded her napkin, slowly, and she said two words I know. That was it. No tears, no raised voice, no visible collapse. Just a woman folding a napkin with the specific stillness of someone who has already decided something the other person in the room does not yet understand. Her name was Diane. She was 54 years old. And what happened next? In the month that followed that quiet moment at that dining table, is one of the most precise and devastating examples of what occurs when a powerful man spends 2 decades mistaking a woman's calm for weakness. This is her story, and I need you to stay with every single word of it. Because the part that changes everything is not where you expect it to be. It never is. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened in that courthouse, 2 years after that dining table moment, you have to go back much further than the divorce. You have to go back to Stone Mountain, Georgia, in 1999. You have to go up back to a two-bedroom apartment with second-hand furniture and pasta 4 nights a week, and two people who were, by every objective measure, nobody special yet. No trust funds, no family wealth, no connections that opened doors. Just a woman named Diane with a finance degree and 8 years of corporate experience and a mind that understood exactly how money moved and where it went wrong. And a man named Gerald Coleman with a business degree from Georgia State, a dream of building a private equity firm, and the kind of natural charisma that makes rooms lean toward him before he has said anything particularly worth leaning toward. They had been dating 2 years. They got married in his aunt's backyard in Decatur in the spring of 1999. 63 guests, two folding tables pushed together for the food, a caterer who arrived an hour late and was forgiven because everything else felt exactly right. It was not a glamorous beginning, but it was a real one. And real, Diane would come to understand much later, is the thing that money finds hardest to hold on to once it arrives in serious quantities. Gerald had vision, genuine, impressive, ahead of its time vision. He could walk into a room full of cautious investors and within 20 minutes have every person in that room believing that the thing he was describing was not only possible, but inevitable, and that they would regret not being part of it. That is a rare gift. It is also on its own entirely insufficient for actually building a business. Because vision without infrastructure is just an expensive idea with good presentation. And the distance between a compelling idea and a functioning company is exactly where most promising ventures collapse before they become real. That distance is where Diane lived. That distance was her professional home. She had spent 8 years in corporate finance understanding precisely how money behaves when it is organized well, and precisely how fast it disappears when it is not. She understood cash flow modeling, balance sheet architecture, investor reporting frameworks, operational risk assessment, the kind of financial infrastructure that never makes headlines, but determines whether everything built on top of it stays standing when conditions change. When Gerald showed her his business plan in the months before their wedding, she spent 2 full weekends rebuilding the financial model from scratch. Not because his ideas were wrong, they were genuinely right. But right ideas presented without structural support do not survive contact with real investors and real markets. She gave him structure, she gave him systems. She gave him the organizational backbone that made it possible for his vision to actually meet the world without collapsing on first contact. And when that began working, neither of them called it anything other than us. That word felt accurate. It felt like the complete truth of what they were. Diane did not yet know that one person can quietly stop meaning a word while the other person is still fully living inside it, and that the gap between those two positions is where the most invisible and lasting damage happens. Coleman Capital Advisors opens first office in Midtown Atlanta in January of 2001. 14th floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner, and the particular combination of hope and financial anxiety that new businesses carry in their walls. Gerald had one full-time employee, a part-time bookkeeper, and 18 months' worth of carefully cultivated investor relationships he had been building through networking events and personal connections, and the sheer sustained force of his ability to make people believe in what he was building. Diane kept her corporate job for the first year. At night and on weekends, she came home and became the other half of the company. She handled client scheduling. She organized Gerald's investor presentations so that the numbers supported the narrative rather than contradicting it. She managed the bookkeeping when the part-time bookkeeper quit in March of that first year without adequate notice. She wrote correspondence. She prepared quarterly investor summaries. She built the reporting systems that gave early investors confidence that their money was being managed with precision and accountability. There were nights she sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning with spreadsheets open and documents stacked beside a coffee cup that had gone cold, working, because the business needed someone to work when the visionary needed to rest. She did not call this sacrifice at the time. She called it partnership. She believed entirely in what they were building, and she believed entirely in him, and those two things were not yet distinguishable from each other. In October of 2002, Gerald closed the company's first commercial property deal, a mixed-use development in Gwinnett County. His assistant texted Diane when the papers were signed, and Diane opened champagne before Gerald came home. He walked through the front door, saw the champagne on the counter, and sat down on the kitchen floor right there in his good suit. He did not make it to the couch. He sat on the floor the way people sit when something enormous they have been holding finally releases. And he cried, not the composed, dignified kind that looks presentable, the real kind that sounds like relief. And Diane sat down on the floor beside him. He held her face in both his hands. He looked at her directly and said, "We did this." 2 words. We, not I, not him alone. We, that word was the last honest accounting of the truth between them. And neither of them knew it yet. I need you to stay with me here. Because what comes next, the way success rearranges a person quietly, year by year, piece by piece, in ways too gradual to identify in real time, is the part that women who have loved ambitious men are going to recognize somewhere deep and specific in themselves. You need to hear all of it, because the recognition is the point. The business grew. By 2005, Coleman Capital had closed 14 deals and managed a portfolio worth just over $30 million. By 2008, as a national financial crisis was collapsing portfolios and businesses and careers across the country, Coleman Capital had been positioned conservatively, because Diane had pushed persistently for conservative positioning in the 18 months prior, when the money felt unlimited and everyone around them was being reckless. And that conservatism meant they survived when others collapsed, and acquired distressed assets at prices that would look extraordinary within a few years. There was a specific meeting in early 2008 where 3 of Gerald's senior advisors argued for aggressive expansion even as the first real cracks appeared in the market. Diane had spent the previous weekend preparing a risk analysis document. Nobody asked her to do it. She did it because someone needed to, and she was the someone available. She laid that document on the conference table. Gerald looked at it for 30 seconds. He looked at his advisors. He said, "We hold." That decision saved the company, not Gerald's instincts. That document, that weekend of unprompted work by a woman whose name would not appear in a single subsequent interview, about how Coleman Capital navigated the financial crisis. In the minutes of that meeting, the decision was attributed to Gerald's judgment. In the stories Gerald told afterward, it was attributed to his instincts and his discipline. Diane noticed. She said nothing. She was keeping a file. The way women who understand something is happening, but are not yet ready to name it, keep files. Carefully, privately, without knowing yet precisely what the evidence is being collected for. By 2012, Coleman Capital Advisors was managing a portfolio worth north of $200 million. Gerald was on the cover of a regional business magazine. He was speaking at investment conferences, being quoted in financial publications, described in interview profiles as a self-made visionary who had built his company from a rented office on the strength of his instincts and his discipline, and his capacity to see opportunities where other investors saw only risk. The new office was in Buckhead. Premium address, custom millwork. A receptionist who answered phones like she was the last line of defense before something important. The carpet cleaner smell of the first office was something Gerald had stopped mentioning publicly. And Gerald himself had changed, not overnight. I want to be precise about this. The overnight version would have been easier to identify and respond to. This was the slow version. The version that arrives piece by piece over years. So, gradually that by the time the shape of it is fully visible, the person experiencing it has already normalized most of it, and is no longer certain which moment would have been the right one to name it. The first signs were small enough to explain away. Comments about how Diane dressed at investor dinners. Gentle corrections delivered in front of colleagues about things she said in meetings that Gerald felt were too casual for the level of client they were now working with. A suggestion that she be more selective about which company events she attended because certain clients had expectations that were better managed without a spouse present. Diane told herself these were reasonable adjustments to a more public life. She told herself Gerald was under significant pressure, and pressure changes how people communicate. She told herself she was being too sensitive. Women who love the people they are married to tell themselves these things for longer than is good for them. It is not weakness. It is loyalty, searching desperately for a context that will make the evidence less frightening. Because the alternative, naming what you are actually observing, requires a reckoning that changes everything. And the women who have loved these men know exactly how long you can postpone that reckoning. Some of you watching this right now know exactly how long. By 2015, the comments had become consistent criticism. Gerald started narrating the company's history in exclusively first-person terms in every public context. I built this company from a rented office. I made the call to hold in 2008 when everyone else was expanding. I survived the financial crisis through discipline and foresight. Diane sat in conference rooms and at dinner tables and listened to her husband describe a singular journey that she knew, from the inside of every decision that mattered, had never been singular. She said nothing publicly, because she understood enough about powerful environments to know that correcting powerful men in public, especially your own husband, creates a category of consequences that outlast the correction by years. So she stayed quiet, and her quiet was being read by Gerald as agreement, as acceptance, as the posture of a woman who had fully absorbed and endorsed the story he was telling. It was not. It was observation, careful, continuous, increasingly clear-eyed observation. And what she was observing, with a growing and particular and terrible clarity, was that the man she had married in 1999 was being progressively replaced by a performance. And the performance had no room, no architecture, no language, no space of any kind. For a woman who remembered too accurately the mechanics of the actual building, the traveling started around 2016, and it was different from business travel, which has always been part of Gerald's life. Different in texture, different in rhythm, different in the quality of explanation it came with. Miami on weekends described with decreasing specificity as investor cultivation. Los Angeles for relationship development meetings that produced no names when she asked about them. A summit in Dubai that extended from 4 days to 9, with explanations that became progressively less coherent the more she asked. His phone began spending nights face down or in his jacket pocket. He started taking calls sitting in his car in the driveway after dark. His assistant Carla, who had been genuinely warm with Diane for years, began finding reasons to route her communications away from Gerald's calendar. When Diane raised this directly in the spring of 2017, Gerald said she was misreading logistics. He said successful people kept certain things appropriately compartmentalized. And then he introduced a new piece of language that Diane marked very carefully. He said she'd always struggled with the pace of his life. That was the first time that narrative appeared. The idea that she struggled, that she couldn't keep up, that her discomfort was a product of her limitations rather than his choices. She filed it beside the other things she had been noticing. The file was getting heavy. Stay with me. Because what was sitting on that tablet on a Thursday evening in September of 2017 is the moment everything in this story changes direction. And I want you to understand exactly what Diane felt when she found it, because it is not what you expect. The confirmation came on a Thursday evening in September of 2017. Diane was in Gerald's home office looking for insurance documents. They were refinancing a property, and the lender needed the paperwork by Friday morning. She was not looking at his devices. She was at the file cabinet on the left side of his desk when his tablet on the corner of the desk lit up with a message notification. The message was not ambiguous. It did not require interpretation or context, or the benefit of any doubt. Last weekend in Charleston was everything. I keep replaying it. Don't make me wait too long for the next one. There was a photograph attached to the contact. A woman Diane did not recognize, 30-something. Beautiful in the specific way of someone who has been carefully and expensively curated. Her name was Tanya Shields. Diane stood in that office and looked at the screen. And what arrived in her was not what she had always imagined arriving, if a moment like this ever came. She had imagined devastation, immediate, overwhelming, structural collapse. What came instead was stillness, clean, complete, clarifying stillness. The kind that descends when something you have half known for a long time finally presents itself with its documentation, and you no longer have to spend energy on the exhausting work of pretending you don't suspect it. The pretending was over, the thing was real, and in the stillness that followed she understood, with a clarity she had not felt in years, exactly where she was and exactly what was going to happen next. Gerald came home at 11:30. He loosened his tie, walking through the kitchen the way he always did. A motion so habitual it was almost tender, a reminder of who he had been before he became who he was. He stopped when he registered Diane's face and the tablet on the counter. His expression did not fall into guilt or shame or the particular grief of a person who understands the magnitude of what they have done. It settled into irritation, the specific, recognizable irritation of a man whose timeline has been disrupted by an inconvenience he is already calculating how to manage. His first sentence, the very first thing he said was, "You went through my things. Not I'm sorry. Not let me explain. Not I never meant for you to find it this way. An accusation directed at Diane for the crime of standing in a room where the truth had illuminated itself without her permission. I want every woman watching this to sit with that sentence for a moment, because that sentence, his first sentence, is the full portrait of who Gerald Coleman had become by the fall of 2017. Not the man from the kitchen floor in 2002. Not the man who held her face in his hands and said, "We did this." This man, the one whose first instinct, when caught, was to make it her fault. He poured bourbon. He leaned against the counter. He said, "It isn't serious." She asked him how many weekends in Charleston an unserious relationship required. He said, "You want the truth? You stopped growing with me." That sentence was designed to wound. It did land for a moment, the way those sentences land, when they are delivered by someone who knows precisely where your uncertainties live, because they have lived beside them for 22 years. And then Diane looked at this man, whose tears she had held on a kitchen floor in 2002, whose panic attacks she had talked down before major investor meetings, whose first commercial deal she had helped structure from a spreadsheet she built while he slept, whose company she had held together from the inside for 2 decades, while he stood at the front of it accepting credit for its coherence. And she understood something with complete and permanent clarity. She was not in a conversation with her husband. She was in a conversation with a story. The story a man tells himself when he needs to believe his success was entirely his own creation. And in that story, she was an early chapter he had decided the narrative no longer required. Then he said the thing that told her this had been planned. "I've already spoken to an attorney. I'm prepared to offer you the Peachtree condo and 18 months of support. The prenuptial agreement protects everything else." Offering, he used the word offering. The way you offer someone a compensation package when a professional arrangement has run its course. 22 years, the apartment in Stone Mountain, the pasta 4 nights a week, the champagne on the kitchen floor, the midnight spreadsheets. Her aunt's property, $38,000, every dollar of it, sold and handed to him so he could close his first commercial deal. All of it, apparently, quantifiable as a condo and a year and a half of monthly support. She moved out 12 days later, and Gerald did not wait. Tanya Shields appeared on his social media within 3 weeks, fully, completely. Resort photographs, Buckhead restaurants, her wearing jewelry Diane recognized from a collection she had spent 20 years curating. Gerald was narrating a new story publicly, the story of a man who had evolved past a chapter and moved confidently into the next one. And he was counting on Diane to perform the role he had written for her. The bitter, destabilized, publicly erratic ex-wife who would lose credibility in the process of losing her composure. He had miscalculated her for 22 years. He was miscalculating her now. He simply did not yet know it. Don't go anywhere. Because what Diane did in the weeks that followed, quietly, carefully, without a single public word, is the part that changes everything. And it starts with one attorney and one clause in a document Gerald never expected anyone to challenge. Diane found Sandra Okafor through a referral from a colleague who described her as the attorney you hire when the other side thinks they have already won. Sandra had 23 years of experience in complex high-asset divorce proceedings in the state of Georgia. She was Harvard-educated, methodical, and possessed of a quality of focused stillness in high-pressure rooms that communicated, without effort or announcement, that she had already anticipated every move being considered by the people sitting across from her. The kind of attorney that opposing counsel respects in the particular way people respect something they know they cannot easily overcome. Sandra reviewed the prenuptial agreement across the course of a week. She reviewed Gerald's initial financial disclosures. She asked Diane detailed, specific, non-leading questions about her actual operational role in Coleman Capital Advisors, not her social role, not her supportive role, her operational role, from the company's founding to the present. And Diane answered with documentation rather than assertion. She brought archived emails spanning 10 years, financial records with her edits visible in every column, internal communications from the company's most consequential periods, the original pitch decks she had rebuilt from scratch, the 2008 risk analysis, operational restructuring plans she had designed, and Gerald had implemented and publicly attributed to his own instincts. Sandra reviewed all of it over 2 weeks. Then she sat across from Diane, laced her fingers on the desk, and said with complete composure, "Your husband made a significant assumption." Diane asked her what assumption. "He assumed you'd be too heartbroken to remember what you actually did." She pointed to a clause in the prenuptial agreement, language addressing material marital contributions to business growth occurring after the date of marriage. "If we can demonstrate that your contributions materially affected the growth and stabilization of Coleman Capital Advisors, this agreement has a serious problem." Diane asked how serious. Sandra looked at her directly. Serious enough that we are in a very different negotiation than your husband thinks he is in. That was the first time in months that Diane felt something other than grief move through her. What she felt was the specific and clarifying sensation of a woman who has just been handed back a version of herself she'd set down so long ago she had almost forgotten it belonged to her. Dangerous, that was the word she used later, describing that moment. For the first time in a very long time, she felt dangerous, and she was right. Stay with me. Because what Sandra's forensic team uncovered when they started following the money, what was buried in Gerald's financial structure that he had never imagined anyone would have the access or the motivation to look for. That is where this story becomes something the other side had no strategy for. The discovery process in a high net worth Georgia divorce is methodical and exhaustive and deliberately uncomfortable for the party with something to conceal. It requires full financial disclosure across every entity and account, document production, depositions conducted under oath, and forensic accountants, professionals who blend auditing expertise with investigative methodology, who follow money the way experienced investigators follow suspects, with patience and precision, and the understanding that financial deceptions almost always leaves a trail. Because money, as Sandra told Diane in one of their evening calls, leaves fingerprints on everything it touches. Sandra brought in Dr. Patricia Hines, a forensic CPA, who had served as an expert witness in more than 200 high-asset divorce proceedings across the Southeast over 30 years. She was 60 years old, deliberate and precise in her speech, and possessed of the specific confidence of a woman who has been the most technically prepared person in every room she has entered for 3 decades. Diane liked her immediately. She trusted her in the way you trust people whose competence is visible rather than performed. Gerald's legal team was led by Charles Whitfield, 60 years old, silver-haired, the kind of attorney whose entire professional identity is constructed on the assumption that the other side will tire before he does. In the first formal mediation session with both legal teams and both parties present at a conference table in a law office with floor-to-ceiling windows and art chosen for price rather than meaning, Charles Whitfield looked at Diane and asked, in the specific tone calibrated to make the question sound reasonable while the question itself is not, "Mrs. Coleman, would you characterize your primary role during the marriage as domestic support?" Diane looked at him. She took one breath. Then she said, "My primary role was making your client credible enough to afford you." Sandra set her pen down. Gerald's jaw moved once. Charles Whitfield smiled the smile of a man who has decided that a woman who speaks this way in mediation has revealed something about her emotional state that will be useful to him. He was wrong about what she had revealed. What she had revealed was that she was not going to perform the role of the manageable, cooperative, exhausted ex-wife for the convenience of anyone's strategy. What she had revealed was that the woman across the table had spent 22 years being underestimated and had made sophisticated and productive use of the experience. Mediation failed. Gerald's offers were structured for a woman who was financially frightened and emotionally depleted and wanted resolution more urgently than she wanted accuracy. Diane was not that woman, Discovery continued, and what Dr. Hines and her team began finding when they moved through Gerald's financial disclosures was not one clean, dramatic revelation. It was a series of smaller findings that assembled, over weeks, into a picture considerably more complicated than anything Gerald's team had accounted for in their strategy. There were substantial asset transfers that had occurred in the 18 months preceding Gerald's filing date. Transfers timed with the precision that forensic accountants immediately recognize as asset positioning rather than ordinary financial activity. There were limited liability companies and investment vehicles that had not appeared in Gerald's initial financial affidavit. Entities that held real property and investment interests legally required to be disclosed in full during divorce proceedings. There was a commercial property in Savannah held by one of those undisclosed entities. There was a partial ownership interest in a hospitality development in Nashville that Gerald had described under oath in deposition as a minimal passive investment worth approximately $2 million. Dr. Hines's team, using comparable transaction analysis and standard valuation methodology, arrived at a figure for Gerald's stake closer to $11 million. There were offshore adjacent investment structures that, while not technically illegal, were organized in ways that became exceedingly difficult to explain cleanly and transparently to a judge who had spent 27 years on the bench watching financially sophisticated people attempt exactly this kind of explanation. Gerald's attorneys had presumably advised him on the risks of what discovery would find, but men who have spent years controlling narratives sometimes arrive at the dangerous conviction that they also control the processes designed to investigate those narratives. They do not. Discovery does not negotiate. Discovery does not respond to confidence or expensive legal representation. Discovery follows the money, and the money in Gerald Coleman's case had left a trail that Dr. Patricia Hines followed with 30 years of methodical, patient, court-admissible precision. The settlement calls started coming more frequently after the first significant discovery findings were delivered to opposing counsel. The tone of correspondence changed. The words, efficiency and discretion, began appearing, with the specific frequency of words deployed by people who are frightened and are attempting to communicate that they would strongly prefer to be frightened in private. Gerald called Diane directly in November, first personal call in 5 months. He opened with, "You're embarrassing yourself." She said, "No, I'm embarrassing you. Those are not the same thing." He said she was being manipulated by her attorney. She said that was interesting framing from a man whose company she had helped stabilize during a national financial crisis. His voice lowered. "What do you actually want from this, Diane?" She thought about the question before answering it, because it deserved the honest answer rather than the strategic one. "I want the record corrected. I want what I built to be acknowledged. And I want a settlement that reflects reality rather than your preferred version of it." He hung up. 3 days later, his lead counsel contacted Sandra to propose a formal settlement conference. Sandra told Diane that meant weakness. Diane told Sandra that Gerald had never in 22 years voluntarily entered a negotiation from weakness, which meant he was genuinely scared. Sandra said, "Good. Scared is exactly where we need him. Keep watching." Because the settlement conference, and what happened when Gerald opened one specific folder in that room, is the moment his entire strategy collapsed in real time. And the speed of it will surprise you. The conference was held at a downtown Atlanta law firm. Floor-to-ceiling windows over the city. Cold institutional air conditioning. Art on the walls chosen for its cost. Gerald arrived in a charcoal suit Diane recognized. She had been standing beside him when a tailor in Miami measured him for it 3 years earlier during a weekend trip she had organized, to a city she had suggested, for a meeting she had helped prepare him for. He did not look at her when he entered. His team opened with a settlement offer of $40 million, cash, structured assets, and property. The number was designed to sound enormous to a woman who was supposed to be running out of emotional and financial endurance. Sandra and I had discussed this number in advance, and she had walked Diane through exactly what it represented against the full estate valuation, including the undisclosed entities. Sandra slid a counterproposal across the table. Then she slid one additional folder to Gerald's side. "Please open that," she said. Gerald's lead counsel opened it first, then passed it to Gerald. Inside was Dr. Hines's full documentation. The Savannah property, the Nashville investment, the 18 months of pre-filing asset transfers, the complete catalog of financial fingerprints belonging to a man who had been positioning himself for this divorce before he told his wife he had already spoken to an attorney. Gerald opened the folder. Diane watched his face, and she saw for the first time since the marriage began to collapse something she had not previously seen on Gerald Coleman's face in any professional or personal context. She saw fear, not manufactured fear, not performed concern. Real fear, the kind that arrives when a man understands that the walls he built around something are not, in fact, as solid as he believed them to be. Gerald rejected the $40 million offer before his attorneys could stop him. Diane rejected it from her side simultaneously. And in the hallway afterwards, Sandra said quietly, "He came into that room believing this was still his negotiation. He is leaving understanding that it is not." That shift mattered more than any number. In litigation, momentum is not abstract. Everyone in a room feels it when it moves. And it had moved completely. Then Harrison Webb entered the story. And I need to tell you about Harrison Webb carefully, because his role is not what it might appear from the outside, and because what he represented to Gerald Coleman was something more damaging than any legal filing. He represented the specific and irrecoverable moment when someone Gerald had spent years trying to impress looked past him and saw clearly the woman he had been erasing. Harrison Webb was 61 years old, born in Birmingham, Alabama, son of a schoolteacher and a steelworker who worked 30 years in a mill. He had built one of the most significant private equity and commercial real estate portfolios in the American Southeast over 3 decades. Webb Capital Group, managing assets in excess of $4 billion. He possessed the quality of authority that comes specifically from having built real things from nothing and survived every phase of the building. The kind that does not need to announce itself in any room because the rooms themselves often belong to him. Gerald had spent years referencing Harrison Webb's name at dinner parties with the breathless reverence of a man who needs another man's success as the measuring stick for his own aspirations. He had attended Harrison's industry events. He had sought introductions through mutual contacts. He had never quite broken through into the inner circle. What Gerald did not know, because he had long since stopped paying attention to Diane's independent, professional life with any genuine interest, was that Diane and Harrison had spoken at a Financial Literacy Foundation event in Atlanta 3 years earlier. An event Diane had attended alone because Gerald had a conflict, and because by that point she attended most things alone. They had talked about operational infrastructure and emerging real estate ventures, a subject Diane knew deeply and Harrison found genuinely worth discussing. He had given her his card. She had kept it the way you keep things you cannot yet fully explain, but that feel like they might matter someday. Now, in the context of a divorce that had become visible enough in Atlanta's business community to affect Coleman Capital's investor relationships and create questions in the due diligence process, Harrison's team was conducting on a potential acquisition of one of Gerald's subsidiaries. It mattered. Sandra reached out through a mutual contact to Harrison's office, not to solicit anything inappropriate, but to ensure that the public record regarding Diane's operational role in Coleman Capital's history was accurate. Harrison, it turned out, had already been paying attention. His due diligence team had surfaced questions about the company's operational leadership attribution that were relevant to valuation. What his team had documented aligned in significant ways with what Sandra and Dr. Hines had been assembling. Harrison Webb already knew the truth about who had built what inside Coleman Capital Advisors. He simply had not yet had occasion to say it in a room where Gerald could hear him. Sandra insisted Diane attend a charity gala 3 weeks before the trial date. Diane had been largely private since moving to the Peachtree condo, not hiding but also not performing the composed public presence that people expected. "You've been quiet long enough," Sandra said. "Quiet women in these situations get written as guilty. You have nothing to be guilty of and everything to be visible about." The gala was at a luxury hotel in Buckhead. The room was full of the people Gerald had spent his entire professional career trying to impress: investors, developers, executives, the financial infrastructure of Atlanta's business community. People who had known them as a couple. People whose invitations had quietly stopped arriving after the separation became known. Diane wore a deep navy dress, simple and structured. Her mother's pearl earrings. Her mother had passed in 2009, and the earrings were what she wore when she needed to feel her presence at something important. Nothing theatrical, nothing performed. She has never believed the point of a significant moment is the drama surrounding it. The point is the truth the moment carries. She saw Gerald the moment she entered the ballroom. He was standing near investors, she recognized, holding bourbon, performing the relaxed confidence of a man who has decided everything is under control. His smile disappeared when he saw her. Not faded, not dimmed, disappeared, instantly and completely. Tanya was beside him. Tanya saw what happened to his face before he could rebuild it. That mattered. Then Harrison Webb approached from Diane's left, tall, silver tie. The particular quality of a man who has nothing left to prove to any room. "Diane Coleman," he extended his hand. "I've been hoping the occasion would come up." They talked for 35 minutes. About infrastructure, about the 2008 risk decisions, about operational frameworks, and what it actually takes to scale a business versus what gets publicly celebrated. Harrison spoke about these things with the fluency of someone for whom this is not theory, but the substance of his actual life's work. Gerald eventually approached, Tanya close behind. Gerald extended his hand to Harrison with the strained warmth of a man performing confidence he is not feeling in any part of his body. "Harrison, I didn't realize you two had met." Harrison, before Diane could respond, said, "Diane's work is impressive. Present tense. Work. Not helpfulness, not support, not contribution. Work." Gerald's expression moved through several things in rapid succession before he could control it. He recovered enough to say, "She was very supportive in the early years." Harrison looked at him directly and said, without raising his voice, without any additional emphasis, "Operational leadership isn't support. It's the load-bearing wall." 4 seconds of silence. Nobody in earshot said anything. Tanya looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at a fixed point on the table between them. And Harrison turned back to Diane and continued the conversation as though the previous exchange had been entirely unremarkable, which made it, paradoxically and perfectly, more devastating than any dramatic public confrontation could have produced. Later at the valet, Harrison said, "Whatever happens in the next few weeks, don't underestimate what you built." He paused. Gerald confused being visible with being valuable. "It's a common mistake. In a courtroom, it becomes an expensive one." Diane thanked him. The night air was warm. Atlanta was fully lit below her. She stood there and understood with the particular clarity that arrives after a very long period of confusion that the woman she had been in that Stone Mountain apartment, the one with the midnight spreadsheets and the cold coffee, and the $38,000 sacrifice, and the absolute, unshakable certainty of her own competence, was not gone. She had simply been waiting, with the patience of someone who has nothing to prove to anyone who isn't paying attention. For the moment when the truth of her existence could no longer be argued away. That moment was 3 weeks from now. She was ready. The morning of the trial, Diane woke at 5:30 and did not go back to sleep. She stood at the condo window and watched Atlanta come awake in the dark. The slow brightening of the skyline, the first headlights on the highway below. The particular quality of southern light in the minutes before the day fully commits to itself. She was not anxious. That surprised her. She had expected anxiety. What arrived instead was the same clean stillness from the night she found the message on Gerald's tablet. The stillness that means you have already processed the worst, and what remains now is simply the business of moving through to the other side. She dressed carefully, black dress, simple and structured, her mother's pearl earrings. She was almost at the door when Sandra called. After the basics, ready, yes, already, Sandra mentioned the car. Harrison Webb's office had called that morning. He was sending transportation, a black Lamborghini Aventador. Diane stood still in her hallway. She understood exactly what it would look like. She understood the media would be outside the courthouse. She understood Gerald's team would see it. She understood all of it with complete clarity. And she thought about every blog that had called her bitter, every anonymous source that had implied instability, every dinner party where Gerald had narrated the company's history in first person while she sat across the table and said nothing, every investor conference where he accepted credit for decisions she had made, every year she had spent building the load-bearing wall and watching someone else accept the applause for the building. She put on her jacket. She picked up her bag. Tell them 5 minutes. The Lamborghini sat in front of her building in the early morning with the quiet authority of something that knows precisely what it is. The driver, professional and suited, opened the door. She got in. The city moved past the windows differently from inside that car, not because the city had changed, but because she had. When they approached the courthouse, the media presence was visible half a block away. Cameras, journalists, photographers. The organized intensity of people who know a story is about to crystallize into its defining moment. When the car reached the curb and the driver opened her door and Diane stepped out, every camera turned. She heard her name from multiple directions simultaneously. She heard questions shouted from 3 different microphones. And at the top of the courthouse steps, she saw Gerald Coleman. He was standing with Charles Whitfield and 2 members of his legal team, and he was watching the car with the expression of a man trying to process something faster than his composure can manage. When he registered that it was Diane, stepping out of it, his face went through several distinct things in rapid succession, and none of them were the unbothered public confidence he had been performing for months. He came down the steps faster than was dignified. What is this? She adjusted her bag strap. Transportation. He fell into step beside her. Don't play games with me, Diane. She kept walking. You usually prefer games when you're winning. I understand the difference. Are you involved with Harrison Webb? She stopped walking. She turned and looked at her soon-to-be former husband, standing on courthouse steps in the morning light after everything, after the discovery, after the forensic accountants, after the $40 million offer she had rejected, after operational leadership as the load-bearing wall had been said in front of investors at a Buckhead gala, and his primary concern was whether she was seeing someone. You sound emotional, she said, and walked through the doors. Inside, the courtroom had the specific gravity of a place where things get decided permanently. Judge Margaret Calloway had 27 years on the bench, and the particular patience of someone who has seen every version of this story and long ago made peace with all of them. The proceedings lasted most of the day. Sandra presented the operational evidence first. 22 years of documentation, placing Diane not at the margins of Coleman Capital Advisors, but at the center of its most consequential decisions. Every objection from opposing counsel was addressed methodically. Dr. Patricia Hines testified for 2 hours. Her testimony was dense and technically precise, and delivered with the confidence of someone who has been the most prepared person in the room for 30 consecutive years. Gerald's team cross-examined her for 45 minutes and did not materially alter any of her conclusions. At one point, Judge Calloway leaned forward to examine the 2008 risk analysis document, the one Gerald had presented as his instinct, and Diane had spent a weekend preparing without being asked, and asked Sandra to clarify the preparation timeline. Sandra clarified. The judge made a note. Diane believed, watching her write, that the note contained something important. During the presentation of evidence related to the Nashville hospitality investment, the one Gerald had described under oath as worth approximately $2 million, and Dr. Hines had valued at closer to 11. Gerald Coleman stood up at the defense table without being called upon and said, loudly and clearly, "This is completely and utterly fabricated." Every conversation in the room stopped at exactly the same moment. Judge Calloway looked at him over her reading glasses. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to, Mr. Coleman, she said. at the volume of a woman who has not needed volume in 27 years. Sit down, he sat. Charles Whitfield placed a hand on his arm. Tanya, in the gallery, went completely still, and Diane looked at the table in front of her and allowed herself the small private knowledge that a man who loses his composure before a judge who has spent 27 years watching financially sophisticated people attempt to manage her perception has just donated something to the other side that no legal strategy can fully recover. Court adjourned without a final ruling, but the momentum had shifted in a way that every person in that room understood, and no one on Gerald's side was prepared to publicly dispute. On the courthouse steps, the media surrounded her, and a reporter asked, "Does today feel like revenge?" Diane looked directly into the camera. She took one breath. "Revenge is emotional," she said. "Accountability is necessary. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in the record being accurate." That sentence was on social media within the hour. By evening, it was in financial forums and women's professional networks and legal blogs and evening news segments in 3 states. By the following morning, Diane had messages from women across the country, women whose labor had been erased, women who had signed agreements they didn't fully understand at 32 years old, standing at the edge of a marriage they believed was going to last. Women who had built things from inside someone else's vision and then been written out of the story of the building. Women who needed to know whether the truth survives when powerful men decide to bury it. Diane answered as many as she could, because they were not writing to her about a divorce. They were writing to ask whether a woman who has been systematically minimized has any real recourse when the minimization becomes a legal position. And the answer, Diane was now in a position to say with complete and documented confidence, was yes. The final settlement negotiations took place over 2 more weeks, quiet and private, with none of the arrogance that had characterized every earlier phase. Gerald's team reached out to Sandra the morning after court adjourned with a revised number. Counterproposal, they came back. The rhythm had the particular efficiency of parties who have fully internalized that the other side is not going to become desperate or cooperative enough to accept less than the evidence supports. The final settlement was signed on a Tuesday afternoon in Sandra's conference room. It included equity interests in Coleman Capital's subsidiary portfolio, the Savannah commercial property, a structured participation in the Nashville hospitality development across a defined term, significant liquid assets, multiple real property holdings, provisions addressing the 3 years of pre-filing transfers, Dr. Hines had documented with surgical precision, totaling in full valuation $75 million. When Sandra confirmed the final number, Diane sat with it for a long moment before saying anything. Not because the number didn't feel significant, because she was thinking about $38,000. Her aunt's property, sold in 2001, handed to Gerald so he could close his first commercial deal. The arithmetic between 38,000 and 75 million is not just mathematics. It is 22 years of a woman being told she was incidental to something she was holding together from the center. When the last signature was in place, Sandra looked at her across the table and said, "You know what actually won this case?" Diane said she wanted to hear the answer. You stopped needing his approval. The moment you stopped needing it, every decision you made came from clarity instead of fear. And clarity beat their strategy every single time. Diane carried that sentence home in the car. Watching Atlanta move past the window in the late afternoon light, turning it over the way you turn over, something that is both simple and the truest thing you have heard in years. About a year after the settlement, Diane began consulting, working with women entrepreneurs on operational infrastructure, financial systems, business structure. The things she had been doing inside Gerald's company for 22 years, she was now doing for women who were building companies of their own and needed someone who understood both the vision side and the mechanics side of what building actually requires at every stage. She was good at it. She was very good at it. And she says that not with arrogance, but with the particular confidence of a woman who spent 2 decades being told she was not the expert in the room and who is now sought out specifically because she is. Several months into consulting, she ran into Gerald at an industry reception, smaller crowd. Quieter room, he was alone. They spoke briefly near the entrance, with the specific courtesy of people who have decided the war is over. And the only reasonable posture now is civility in the aftermath. He said she looked well. She said he did too. There was a pause. Then he asked, "Did you ever actually love me?" She looked at him, not with anger, not with contempt, with the honest recognition of a woman who is done performing emotions she does not genuinely feel. "Yes," she said. For a very long time, he was quiet. Then why fight me the way you did?" She thought about all the possible answers. About dignity, about the record, about what it costs to help build something from the inside and then be told you were only ever watching from beside it. She settled on the truest one. "Because you confused my calm for surrender," she said. and I needed you to understand that it never was. He had nothing left to say. Her car arrived. She got in. And as Atlanta moved past the window in the evening light, she thought about every version of this story that doesn't end the way hers did. All the women who take the first offer and disappear. All the contributions buried under revised histories and first-person narratives. All the midnight hours that never get credited. All the load-bearing walls that hold up buildings whose architects accept awards for solo construction. She thought about them for a long time. She still does. Now, I want to give you what Diane asked me to make sure you leave here with. Not inspiration content, not repostable quotes. Real things learned through real cost that she wishes someone had told her before she needed them. The first is this. Your contribution does not disappear because someone stops acknowledging it. The emails existed, the financial records existed, the operational documents existed. The forensic trail of 22 years of midnight work was sitting in files that Gerald had long since stopped thinking about, waiting for the moment when someone with the right tools and the right motivation would look at them carefully. The truth of what you have done does not require anyone's permission to remain true. It is there. It is findable. And in the right hands, in the right room, with the right documentation, it speaks louder than any revised narrative. Remember that. Whatever you are building right now, wherever your fingerprints are on something, keep the evidence. Not because you expect a courtroom, because the truth deserves a record even when everyone around you is pretending it doesn't exist. The second thing is this: calmness is not passivity. It is the most powerful strategic position a woman can occupy in a room that is expecting her to collapse. Gerald interpreted Diane's composure as compliance for 22 years. He interpreted her stillness as acceptance. He interpreted her patience as the behavior of a woman who had made peace with her circumstances and had no intention of challenging them. He was completely and catastrophically wrong. Her calm was not the absence of a response. It was the response, the one that gave her the time and the clarity to observe accurately, to document carefully, to make decisions from a position of understanding rather than reaction. Emotional women give their opponents permission to dismiss them. Diane refused to grant that permission across months of provocation, public humiliation, legal pressure, and smear campaigns. That refusal was not performance, it was strategy. And it was the foundation on which everything else was built. The third thing, and the one that matters most: loyalty should never require self-erasure. Diane loved Gerald Coleman genuinely for a long time, and in the way that people love the version of someone they knew before the money arrived and changed the shape of everything. But she loved him at the cost of herself, year by year, piece by piece. In increments so gradual she almost didn't track what was being given away until she was sitting alone in a Peachtree condo that had been offered to her like a severance package. You can love someone completely. You can pour yourself into a shared life and mean every drop of it and give generously and build alongside someone with your whole self present and committed. But the moment that love begins to require you to become smaller, less visible, less credited, less yourself, erased from the story of the very thing you helped create, that is not love making a request of you. That is something else, wearing love's language to extract something love would never actually ask for. And you are allowed to recognize the difference. You are allowed to name it out loud, and you are allowed without guilt and without apology to stop. The Lamborghini on the courthouse steps was not the victory. $75 million was not the victory. The look on Gerald Combs' face when he watched her step out of that car was not the victory. Satisfying as that moment was, and Diane will be the first to tell you it was deeply satisfying. The real victory was smaller and more permanent than any of those things. The real victory was walking back into the woman she had been in that Stone Mountain apartment in 1999 and finding her exactly where she had been left, patient, intact, still entirely herself, still certain of her own competence, still in possession of every midnight hour and every spreadsheet and every decision that had built something real, regardless of whose name ended up on the front of the building. That is rarer than wealth. It is rarer than any settlement figure. And it belongs to every woman who has ever held something together in the dark, while someone else stood in the light and accepted the credit. You were there. The record knows you were there. And when the moment comes, and for some of you watching this, it is already on its way, the record will speak. Make sure you keep it. If this story reached something true in you today, I am asking you to share it. Not for the numbers, because somewhere in your life there is a woman who needs to hear that the quiet ones are not the weak ones, that the patient ones are not the defeated ones, that the woman who folds her napkin slowly across a $14,000 dining table and says, "I know," is not surrendering. She is beginning. Find that woman, send her this video, and leave a comment telling me what part of Diane's story landed for you, because I read them and they matter more than I can say in a closing line. Subscribe if you haven't. because the stories we tell here are not about drama. They are about the kind of dignity that only comes from refusing to let someone else write the story of what you built. I will see you in the next one.